Hey, now that hot summer's over with, it's fall and we need to start talking about fall transition and what can keep us on the fish. Hey, so fall is synonymous with and is ushered in by multiple fronts. And you'll see in the weather forecast on any given week, there's at least one front a week. And it seems like with those fronts, I mean, that's what ushers fall in. We've had a really hot summer. And now we're seeing once a week fronts come in, cooler temperatures at night up here where I'm from. We're getting into the mid 40s and even out in the forecast a little bit here this next week. I see some high 30s popping in. And so the water's cooling off. Even though we've had some warm daytime highs, our nights are getting cooler, and that's ushering in that transition that happens this time of year. You've seen a bunch of videos on it. I want to separate this one out a little bit by maybe giving you some tips, some things that you can do to keep yourself on fish in this transition period. So we know the water's cooling off, and we know that the bass that were offshore, that moved away when the water got hot and were in deeper haunts, are now going to start to move shallower. And they're moving shallow not just because of preference in cool water, they're moving shallow because of bait fish. And the bait fish, you'll notice, did it in the previous video, are moving shallow, and you'll see them around shallow weeds. So if we're largemouth fishing, we need to concentrate on weeds, we need to concentrate on where the bait is, and we need to concentrate on where the fish are moving to, and they're moving to that bait. So there's some things that you can do to stay on the fish, and if you're out on the water, especially in the mornings, you can see some really special things happen right away in the first couple hours of the day related to weeds, bass, and bait fish. And it's pretty obvious that one of the go-to baits at the beginning of the day for me is a topwater bait. And this Yo-Zuri 3DB is a good one to have. It's about the right size. I do move away from the giant topwaters this time of year, and I'll move to the smaller one because all of the bait that's moved into these shallows is smaller. So I'll use a stick bait. And then there's bluegill up there, you'll notice in the weeds, and there's bait in the weeds. And this one here is a bluegill imitator, but you can use whites, bones to imitate bait fish. So stick bait is one of my go-tos this time of year. One of the other go-tos is a swim bait, and there's a bunch of different styles of swim baits that you can use, the Kitech style swim baits. I have here some Divine 6th Sense Divine swim baits, the smaller one. These are the 2.7, and they come in a bunch of different bait fish colors. These are nice because they are the size of the bait fish that are up in the shallows right now. It doesn't seem to be giant big bait fish. We don't have shad up in our part of the country here, so we have smaller minnow species, and they're clouded in the shallows, and these Divines do a good job. So I'll put them on a 1/8 ounce 6th Sense head, and then I'll put that Divine swim bait on the back, and then I have a bunch of different colors, and I'll try to match the minnows, and I'll swim this over the tops and around the sides and down the edges of the weeds. And I'll even turn off the brakes of these weeds, these weed flats that I'm fishing. I'll turn off the brakes and I'll see if there's suspended fish off the side, and a lot of times there are if there's bait present, and I'll also throw this and present this off the edges to them. So that works. A sleeper that works, and especially if everybody else is throwing those, paddle tail Kitech style or even those 6th Sense Divine style, is going back old school and going back to your XPS 5-inch grub. And you can get the ghost shad colored XPS grub and throw that on a 1/8 ounce head, that same head that I just had the Divine on, and present a whole different look, right? This is the OG bait that was developed to try to imitate bait fish. I've caught a ton of bass on this in my life, and I'll go back to that this time of year, especially in pressured water where everybody else is throwing a Kitech. You can go back and swim this, original XPS 5-inch single tail grub back through them and get bit where others aren't getting bit, because it's just a little bit different. That's one thing about bass fishing is some of this stuff that used to work is coming back around again because everybody's using the latest baits and the new fads, and the fish have just seen them and seen them and seen them. Very rarely are they seeing this curly tail presentation anymore, and some fish have never seen it since it came out of style, you know, a dozen years ago. So that's a great swim bait presentation as well. Now to the weeds themselves. The first thing to do, I think, in the weeds is to present them a jig. It's a big meal. I get a grass style jig because typically I'm fishing grass points or the ends of flats that typically have grass in them before they break. And I'm throwing a grass style jig. This one here is from 3G Smallmouth Solutions. And the thing that I like to do about the grass jig is I'm using that pointed head, right? I'm using that pointed head on the jig typically with the vertical line tie. So that thing comes through the weeds nice. And I'm not casting this out and crawling this along the bottom. Rather, I'm casting this out and I'm snapping it through the weeds and letting it fall back down, and I'm snapping it again and letting it fall back down. And they're hitting it on that reaction. And a lot of times on my second snap, I'm hooked up because those fish came over on the first one when I snapped it up and this thing fell down. And then on that second move, when it pops off the bottom, they're grabbing it as it gets up into the weeds. So you'll want to use braided line, and you'll want to snap that jig hard off the bottom. For trailers, you really can't go wrong with something that moves a lot. Fish are active right now, they're feeding, it's fall. I'll use a Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Craw. It's got the real flappy, movie tails. It's probably one of the leading bait trailers there are, but the craw shape on the Ultra Vibe really moves a lot. And I'll get some contrasting colors. If I'm in clearer water, I'll get green pumpkins, the Yabby mud bug, and some blues, and I'll get the green and blue combinations, and they seem to work very well. So I'll use that. I'll use the Guggen Baits Bandito bug. That's just, why mess with what's winning money for folks? Fish just eat it. So I'll make sure I've got a Bandito bug. I'll even cut part of it off so it fits on the jig appropriately, so I don't have too much hanging off the end. This can also be pitched with a Texas Sprig style on its own. But I like the jig, and I've got an all-terrain tackle weed jig coming. I'm trying to remember what the name of that particular bait is, but it's from All Terrain Tackle. I also use a jig if I'll move to tungsten if it gets windy. I like the Reaction Tackles, just their flipping jig, because it's tungsten and it's got a very small profile. This is a 1/2 ounce jig. Here's the difference between a standard 1/2 ounce jig right here, and then obviously a tungsten 1/2 ounce jig. So just a smaller profile with a good heavy weight. And in fact, I'll move up to 3/4 ounce because the 3/4 ounce style, 3/4 ounce weight jig is the same size as most lead 1/2 ounce jigs. So you can get away with a heavier jig. And when I'm snapping, I get a little bit different rate of fall out of a 3/4. So it really depends on the fish's mood, whether I want the lead that falls a little slower, whether I want the tungsten that falls a little faster. But I have those options available. So jigging, not dragging, but really snapping. Then the other thing I'll go to is a square bill. I'm in and around weed flats, right? The minnows are all pushing up into the weeds. And so a lot of times they'll get right up into the weeds, and now you've got a foot or two of water above the weeds, and then you've got the weeds. One of the things that can call fish out of that particular setup is the square bill, and I'll use different colors. I'll use a chartreuse, I'll use a white baitfish one, and I'll use a bluegill one. But I will pull square bills across the tops of those weed flats, and that can be a deadly technique in the fall. Then the last thing that I'll do to mix it up, because again I'm near edges, two more things rather. One is I'll be looking to fish the actual weed edge with a tube, and I'll use a mushroom head jig. This one's from Reaction Tackle, and I'll use Get Bit Baits tubes. I use the 2.75 inch finesse tube, and I'll use it in a number of colors, right? That's one nice thing about it. You can get it in a number of colors. I'll use a standard green, I'll use a standard leech color, and then I'll get some hot colors. I'll use a pink around weed edges, and I'll use the chartreuse. And so that rigged up with that jig, I can not only can I probe it along the weed edge, but I can look out over the break, and if I see any schooling fish out over the break, I can cast this out, and it's got the right rate of fall if you put the right weight in it, and they'll come up and they'll hit that thing like it's a dying minnow coming down from the surface, and you're hooked up before that thing even hits the bottom. They'll run up and get it. So not only are you concentrating on the break, but if you've got forward-facing electronics, you can swing out over the break and see if there's any schooling fish that have pushed minnows up against the edge or are just off the edge or off the break, and you can catch those fish this time of year as well. So those are the standard ones, and then if things get really schooly, which they can, and if that break, if they're out of the weeds and the bite is active and they've kind of are chasing bait, and you get out over that break line, a deadly one here, this was from Brown Dog Tackle, is using an Alabama rig, and I use a 3-hooked one here in Wisconsin is legal. So I'll dress that thing up with some Optimum Bait Golden Shiners for our neck of the woods. It's the perfect sized and style bait, something they haven't seen before, a little breakaway from the Kitech style. But I'll put 3 of them. I'll put 2 heavier ones on the bottom, these tungsten weights, and I'll put a little bit lighter one in the middle so it rides into the middle. The 2 heavier ones keep it keeled. I've got some spinners on the top. You can use copper or silver depending on the preference of the fish, but this Brown Dog Tackle Finesse A-rig is a great thing to whip out over the break when those fish are schooling. One other little touch I'll do to it is I'll dip that center upper tail in some chartreuse just to give it they'll key in on it if they're racing up into this and thinking it's a school of fish. Sometimes it helps them focus on what they're smacking at, and they'll grab that. So I don't sleep on the A-rig. I'll break that thing out in the fall and use it out over break lines if I see suspended or schooling fish. So got to get out there. You're going to endure some cooler mornings because of the temperatures. There's going to be some fog on the water. Let it lift. But get out there. This is a great time of the year to catch some fish, and catch a lot of fish quick because of the nature of what's going on. Fish have kind of gotten away from their summer haunts. They're focused in on bait. They're moving in when the bait moved in, and you'll see it in the mornings a lot of times. You get some great windows. If you get some wind-driven days in the afternoons, it can be great on these flats too, because it just kind of pushes bait in. It kind of concentrates them, and the fish really this time of year, their biological clock is ticking and they're feeding. So they look for opportunities. There'll be one in the morning, there'll be some during the day. Wind-driven situations will help you, but you got to get out there on the water, endure a little bit cooler temperatures anyways, to get through this. But fish are very catchable in this fall transition. Follow the bait, you'll catch the fish. Use some techniques that put you at an advantage, and you'll put more fish in the boat. Hope these tips are helpful, and we'll talk to you next time on the water. If you're looking for one additional tip, check out this video where I talk a little bit about an OG bait that'll help you catch some weed minnow related fish when other baits won't.